Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to take that overwhelming noise of global information and really just distill it down.
Right, down to the essential, the surprising, and the specific insights you need.
To be truly well-informed. And today we are tackling, it's maybe the single most pressing question of our time.
It has to be. The shifting balance of global power.
Specifically, the U.S.-China rivalry.
It's the rivalry that defines the 21st century, isn't it?
Yeah.
It touches everything. Trade, tech, military, domestic policy.
Everything.
And our mission today is to get past that simple narrative of, the inevitable takeover.
Right, that it's just a matter of time.
Exactly. We're going to do a surgical deep dive into the data around this U.S.-China economic crossover. We'll use the source material to figure out what peaconomic supremacy even means.
Okay.
We'll also dissect the monumental structural challenges facing Beijing, and then re-examine the unique privileges and, let's be honest, the serious liabilities of the American economic engine.
For years, if you just listen to the headlines, it seemed like a done deal.
Oh, completely. A foregone conclusion.
China's rise was just staggering. Their growth rates were astronomical. So we want to ask the big question. Is this takeover imminent? Is it distant? Or maybe it's not guaranteed at all.
And we'll be looking at the metrics that actually matter and why the consensus among, the world's biggest economic institutions has started to shift its timeline. It's a fascinating story.
It really is.
And by the time we wrap up this deep dive, you will have a much more nuanced perspective. You'll be able to confidently articulate the strengths and the vulnerabilities of both models.
Because it's a much more complex picture than a simple race to the top.
Far more complex.
Okay, let's get right into it. The core issue first. Because if we're going to talk about one country overtaking another...
You have to define your terms.
Exactly. We have to define what we mean by supremacy. The language of global economics can be, it can be incredibly descriptive, especially with raw GDP figures.
That is absolutely the right place to start. Gross domestic product, GDP, it's the foundational measurement, but there's a pivotal ambiguity in how it's calculated.
And there are two main ways to measure it, right?
Two dominant ways, yes. And they give you completely different answers about who's winning.
So let's start with the first one, the one that's historically been the most important for global power.
That would be nominal GDP.
Let's define that really precisely for everyone. What is it?
It's the raw market value of all the finished goods and services produced inside a country's borders in a given year.
Okay, raw value.
And this is the key part. It's converted directly into U.S. dollars using whatever the current exchange rates are.
So when we look at that specific metric, just nominal GDP, the sources are clear. What's the state of play?
The United States is still firmly in the lead. Often by a massive margin, depending on how currencies are fluctuating that year.
So nominal GDP is about sheer financial size.
Exactly. Think of it as the brute force financial magnitude and liquidity of an economy. It's the country's immediate buying power on the global stage.
The size of the checkbook, basically.
The size of the checkbook available to transact in the world's currency of exchange, yes.
And this isn't just some abstract number on a spreadsheet. This number is directly tied to global power, to hegemony. Why is nominal GDP measured in U.S. dollars so critical for Washington's influence?
Because it's the metric that underpins the entire American-led global economic architecture, the one set up after World War II.
Okay.
Nominal GDP dictates three huge areas of power. First, currency dominance. It's the foundation for the strength of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency.
Which we'll come back to. That's huge.
It's massive. Second, it dictates the sheer scale and depth of American financial markets. Wall Street, right? The immense capital, the liquidity. Those nominal figures are what determine risk and investment. It gives American firms and regulators this incredible international sway.
And the third area?
The country's capacity for raw financial leverage.
Meaning?
The ability to deploy foreign aid, to fund a massive military, to launch huge economic stimulus packages. That all requires the kind of magnitude that's reflected in the nominal figures.
So for the rules of global finance?
Washington still holds the pen. It maintains hegemony because it operates on this immense nominal scale.
Okay, so nominal GDP is about the global projection of power. Writing the rules, financing big projects. That brings us to the second metric, which is equally important but very different. Purchasing power parity, PPP.
Right.
What is PPP actually measuring? What question is it trying to answer that nominal GDP just ignores?
PPP is all about adjusting the economic picture for local realities. It tries to neutralize the effect of exchange rates and different costs of living.
How does it do that?
Imagine you have the same standardized basket of goods and services.
Like rent, food, a coffee.
Exactly. Rent, food staples, a cup of coffee, a tank of gas. You measure what that basket costs in local currency in Beijing versus what it costs in New York. PPP then adjusts the entire national GDP to reflect what that country's output actually buys for its own people at home.
That distinction is so important. It's easy to forget that, while a US dollar might be worth 7 or 8 yuan, what you can buy with that yuan in China is, well, it's a lot more than what you can buy with a dollar here.
Dramatically more. Services are just so much cheaper. So when you run the numbers through that PPP adjustment, what do you get?
And this is the big headline, right? The source fact that often gets simplified.
It is. China has already technically surpassed the US.
And not just recently.
No, they've held this position for several years now. When you factor in the lower cost of labor and resources inside China, their output in terms of actual goods and services delivered to their population is quantitatively larger than the US output.
So that means in terms of sheer domestic economic activity. How many people are being fed, housed, employed? China is arguably running the largest economy in the world.
By that measure, yes.
So if China is already #1 by PPP, I have to ask the obvious question. Why isn't the discussion over? Why do we still talk about the U.S. holding the crown of preeminent economic superpower?
Because global power, as we've defined it, is about projecting financial and geopolitical force externally.
And that's still nominal.
That remains nominal. PPP is vital for understanding domestic welfare. I mean, it's the best metric we have for seeing how China lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, which is an incredible achievement.
Unprecedented.
But that domestic strength doesn't translate into global liquidity or financial dominance. You can't pay for a multi-billion-dollar trade deficit with PPP figures. You need hard, freely convertible, widely accepted currency.
And the global financial system, commodities trading, international lending.
All denominated in nominal dollars, not in adjusted yuan.
So that is the essential insight you need to take away from this first part. China's PPP lead reflects an amazing internal achievement. They've created immense domestic buying power, improved the standard of living.
But the mechanics of global finance, the things that determine strategic influence and political leverage, still run on the massive liquid power of U.S. nominal GDP.
The distinction is vital if you want to avoid those simplistic interpretations.
Absolutely. We're looking at two different forms of economic power. Domestic strength versus global financial projection. And for now, the rules of the game mean that Washington's nominal figure keeps the crown.
Okay, so now that we've calibrated the metrics, we need to talk about the rise itself. The fact that China is even in this conversation.
Let alone leading in one of the metrics.
Right. It's a story of economic metamorphosis that is just, it's unlike anything else in history. So looking at the sources, what kind of transformation are we really talking about post-1978?
We're talking about a pace and scale of development that truly has no parallel. None. The pivot point, the Big Bang we mentioned, was 1978.
Under Deng Xiaoping.
Under Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policies. That was the moment China basically jettisoned its rigid centralized planning and began this managed integration into the global marketplace.
It was like releasing a massive coiled spring.
A perfect analogy. Just a huge release of pent-up economic energy.
So what did that look like on the ground? What were the actual results of that policy shift over the next 3 decades?
Well, the sources lay out a transition from a largely agrarian, very isolated society to becoming the world's foremost manufacturing power.
The factory of the world.
The factory of the world. And this happened through several things at once. First, you had this unprecedented, sustained period of double-digit growth, year after year, all driven by massive state investment in infrastructure.
Roads, ports, dams.
Everything. Second, this massive urbanization process where hundreds of millions of people migrated from the countryside to new coastal manufacturing hubs. And third, they harnessed their enormous population.
The demographic dividend.
That demographic dividend, a massive, cheap, and productive workforce that was integrated almost seamlessly into global supply chains.
That dividend, that huge young population ready to work, that was the ultimate cheat code for growth, wasn't it?
It really was. But history shows us that that economic model, running on cheap labor and just building more stuff, it can't last forever.
At what point did the low-hanging fruits start running out?
The shift really began about a decade ago. It's just the law of diminishing returns in action. When a country is poor, Every dollar you invest in a new power plant or a new highway gives you these enormous returns in productivity.
Of course.
But once the country is saturated with infrastructure, and you could argue China has dramatically overinvested in redundant infrastructure and real estate, the returns on those simple investments just drop off a cliff.
You get to a point where growth has to come from something more complicated than just building another steel mill.
Exactly. And Beijing recognized this. They're now trying to execute this fundamental pivot to shift their growth engine toward what they call high-quality development.
So what defines this next stage? What does high quality mean here?
It means a strategic move up the value chain. They're targeting sectors defined by intellectual property, high-tech manufacturing, advanced services.
So moving from assembling iPhones to designing the chips inside them.
That's the perfect example. Moving from producing vast quantities of cheap smartphones to designing the AI chips that power them. We're talking about critical sectors like advanced semiconductors, biotech, EV technology, green energy.
This pivot is supposed to secure their future, but executing it is another matter.
It's incredibly difficult. And that difficulty leads us right into these severe structural challenges that are acting as these massive headwinds.
And this isn't just a normal economic slowdown. The sources paint a picture of a triple threat. Let's start with the big economic challenge, the middle income trap.
The middle income trap is a classic economic pitfall. It describes an economy that has successfully climbed out of low-income status but then just stalls. It gets stuck before it can reach high-income status.
And China is stuck right now.
It's trapped between two tiers of competition. They are now too expensive to compete on labor costs with emerging manufacturers in, say, Southeast Asia or Africa.
Right.
But they haven't yet achieved the institutional, the educational, the innovative capacity to compete head-to-head with the world's most advanced economies, the U.S., Japan, Germany, the ones that rely on continuous disruptive innovation.
Are there historical parallels here? Other countries that got stuck in that trap?
Oh, absolutely. The classic examples are several Latin American economies like Brazil and Mexico. They saw rapid growth in the mid to late 20th century, got to that middle income level.
And then just plateaued.
They plateaued. They failed to establish true capital fluidity.
Yeah.
And the indigenous innovation needed to break through. They just remained dependent on commodity exports or low-cost assembly instead of high-value knowledge creation.
And China risks the same thing if this pivot to innovation doesn't work.
It does. Because true disruptive innovation often requires a degree of spontaneous bottom-up creativity, a tolerance for failure that could be really hard to manage within a centralized top-down state planning system.
The pressure from that middle income trap is immense. But the sources suggest it might even pale in comparison to the second challenge. You called it a demographic cliff.
It's not just a soft decline, it's a cliff. This is perhaps the single greatest long-term liability China faces.
And the specific cause is well known.
It is. It's the legacy of the decades-long one-child policy, which just dramatically distorted the nation's entire age structure. That policy created a demographic imbalance that will haunt their growth prospects for the rest of this century.
Let's get specific on the effects. How does this structural shift actually put a strain on the economy?
Well, the effect is devastating on two fronts, which economists measure using the dependency ratio.
Okay.
Firstly, the workforce itself is shrinking. Fewer productive workers are entering the market each year to generate wealth. And productivity gains from tech can't easily offset the sheer loss of human labor hours.
And the second front?
You have a rapidly aging population. You hear the phrase getting old before getting rich. The dependency ratio, the ratio of non-working people, so children and retirees, to working age people, is just soaring. This puts an immense, maybe unsustainable strain on their social safety nets.
Pensions, healthcare,
elder care, all of which were never that robust to begin with. It means more and more economic resources have to be diverted to caring for the old rather than productive investment, which just kills your national productivity potential.
It is just staggering to think that a policy designed decades ago to help with poverty is now the single biggest threat to their future growth.
Because it's shrinking the very productive base they relied on, and it's compounded by their high savings rate. People had to save a ton because the state wasn't providing a safety net. Now those savings are being drained for elder care, which slows down the domestic consumption they desperately need to pivot towards.
So you have an economy squeezed by the middle income trap, shrinking from a demographic cliff, and then it also faces these immediate internal financial crises. That's the third threat.
Yes, The immediate threat to stability is often rooted in the property sector crisis. The sources are very clear on this.
This was a huge part of their growth model, wasn't it?
It was everything. Massive debt-fueled property investment. It became the primary store of wealth for the average Chinese citizen. So when giants like Evergrande and Country Gardens started collapsing,
It wasn't just a corporate problem.
it was a systemic risk.
Yeah.
Not just to the debt structure, but to the immense personal wealth of the middle class that was all tied up in housing.
And at the same time, we also saw the government launch these regulatory crackdowns, especially on their big tech companies. How did that play into the instability?
Well, those actions, whatever their intent was, state control, reducing inequality. The immediate effect was that they, as the sources say, spook investors.
Right.
Global capital runs on predictability, on the rule of law. When huge, profitable tech firms face sudden, severe penalties with little transparency, it just erodes confidence.
And capital flees.
Both domestic and international capital flees, or at least delays investment. And that diverts resources away from that high-quality development they need and toward just, stabilization and avoiding risk.
What's so fascinating is that the very things that created their success, the double-digit growth based on infrastructure and demographic scale, are exactly what created these vulnerabilities now.
The debt-laden property sector, the reliance on high investment, the demographic imbalance, it all stems from the same source. And that is why that old narrative of inevitable takeover is just no longer universally accepted.
You can't sustain superpower growth when your three main pillars, labor, stable investment, and predictable policy, are all under such intense tectonic pressure at the same time.
Exactly. The complexity of managing those three forces is why the timeline for overtaking the U.S. has been pushed back so dramatically.
That sets a pretty sobering picture for China. Now let's turn the lens back to the United States. And while Washington has its own profound liabilities, which we absolutely have to talk about,
We do.
its economic structure has these distinct, very difficult to replicate advantages. And let's start with a surprising one. As a contrast to China, demographics.
The U.S. demographic profile is a real anomaly among developed nations, a complete outlier.
How so?
If you look at Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, they're all facing severe population stagnation, rapid aging. It's a similar story to China, maybe just a little less severe. The U.S., however,
It's different.
the U.S. maintains a relatively robust and young demographic profile.
So what's fueling that? Why isn't the U.S. falling off the same demographic cliff as its peers?
In a word, immigration, primarily. The U.S. has historically been and remains a magnet for skilled and working-age people from all over the world.
A constant infusion of new people.
A constant infusion of new workers, new consumers, new innovators, and that counteracts declining domestic birth rates far more effectively than any state policy could. It's a perpetual source of dynamism that China just cannot tap into.
Right, because of its restrictive policies and that demographic legacy.
It's an advantage they simply don't have.
Okay, so beyond just the numbers of people, let's talk about the nature of the American economic engine itself. Its core strength seems to be disruptive innovation.
That's the key difference. It's the difference between a planned economy designed to catch up and a dynamic economy designed to pioneer.
The American model is exceptionally good at taking a new idea from a garage, scaling it to a multi-billion-dollar company, and then taking it global in just a few years.
Exactly. And that's so hard for rivals to replicate through centralized planning, because real disruptive innovation is messy. It's unpredictable. It's often inefficient in its early stages.
Let's break down the components of that synergy, because it's not just one thing. It's this delicate, high-functioning ecosystem.
It really is. It relies on three critical interconnected forces. First, you have the unique cultural and financial infrastructure you see in a place like Silicon Valley.
A culture that accepts failure.
A culture with a high tolerance for risk and an acceptance of failure as just part of the process. That's huge. Second, you have the foundational research base.
The universal.
The world-leading public and private research universities. The Ivy League, MIT, Stanford, plus the robust federal grant system that funds basic research. They are constantly churning out intellectual property and training the next generation of global talent. No other country has that concentration of pure research power.
And the third component has to be the money, because a great idea without fuel just dies on the vine.
Precisely. The third component is the deep, highly liquid, and extremely patient capital markets.
Venture capital, private equity.
Venture capital, private equity, the stock exchanges. These markets are willing to take enormous risks on unproven, long-shot ideas and provide the astronomical funding needed to scale globally overnight.
Like with cloud computing or gene editing or reusable rockets.
All perfect examples. This synergy creates a flywheel effect. Research creates ideas, capital funds the risk, and the culture normalizes the whole disruptive process.
It's an incredible engine, and even if a rival could somehow match that innovative spirit, they still lack what is arguably the single greatest structural asset the U.S. has.
The exorbitant privilege.
It sounds like an academic term, but it really is the definition of American financial power.
It's the crucial asset, yes.
Yeah.
And it was earned through decades of financial stability and the sheer size of that nominal economy we talked about at the beginning.
So where does this privilege come from?
It stems directly from the U.S. dollar's status as the undisputed global reserve currency. It's the currency that oil is priced in, that sovereign debt is issued in, that most international trade is settled in.
So define the privilege for us. What does this status let the U.S. government do that would it would instantly cripple another country if they tried it?
It provides the U.S. with an unparalleled economic cushion. Because the rest of the world needs dollars to do business, there is this constant, immense artificial demand for U.S. assets.
Mainly U.S. Treasury bonds.
Primarily Treasury bonds. And this allows the U.S. government to run massive, persistent, frankly staggering fiscal deficits without suffering the immediate penalty of hyperinflation or currency collapse.
So when the U.S. needs money,
it can effectively print dollars to fund its spending, and the rest of the world has to absorb them because they need dollars for trade. This ability fundamentally subsidizes the American standard of living. It keeps our interest rates lower than they should be, and it lets us finance a massive global military presence.
It's a structural advantage that no amount of industrial policy from a rival can just counter overnight.
It cannot be countered quickly, no.
That is immense power. But we have to avoid that trap of American exceptionalism bias, as the sources warn us. The U.S. economy is far from perfect, and that privilege often masks some deep systemic problems.
We absolutely must address those. Despite these unique advantages, the U.S. faces significant self-inflicted wounds that threaten its long-term resilience. The sources detail three major interconnected liabilities.
Let's start with the one that impacts policy predictability the most. Political polarization.
Political polarization in the U.S. has become more than just a political problem. It's a structural economic pathology.
How so?
It leads to crippling legislative gridlock, frequent fiscal brinkmanship like the debt ceiling crises and government shutdowns we see, unpredictable policy reversals every time an administration changes.
And that volatility erodes confidence.
Both domestic and international confidence. Right. It makes long-term infrastructure investment and fiscal planning incredibly difficult. This inability to execute a consistent national strategy is a serious competitive liability.
And that lack of consistent strategy ties right into the second liability.
Yeah.
A crumbling national infrastructure.
The U.S. infrastructure deficit is just staggering. We are talking about decaying roads, aging electrical grids that are vulnerable to outages, outdated public transit.
It's a direct drag on the economy.
It directly increases the cost of doing business, it slows down the movement of goods, and it reduces national productivity. When you compare it to China, which has consistently poured massive capital into building world-class infrastructure, the U.S. is running on legacy systems that require constant, expensive maintenance that our political paralysis often prevents.
And finally, we have to come back to the flip side of that exorbitant privilege, the staggering national debt.
Yes. The sheer volume of national debt, while we can manage it now because of the dollar status, represents a massive long-term fiscal risk.
And the privilege makes it worse, in a way.
It's amplified because the exorbitant privilege allows politicians to just keep spending far beyond tax receipts without any immediate consequence. If or when global confidence in U.S. fiscal management ever starts to erode, maybe because of our escalating polarization,
that debt load could become a real problem.
It could become instantly fatal to the economy. It's a deferred liability that just gets bigger every single year.
And the rivalry with China itself, specifically this idea of decoupling, has created a very modern economic consequence for the U.S., hasn't it?
It has. For decades, the U.S. consumer and the whole economy benefited enormously from China's hyper-efficient, low-cost manufacturing.
Cheap imports kept prices down.
They were a massive deflationary lever for the U.S. They kept consumer prices stable, even when demand was high. But now, as supply chains are intentionally being decoupled or restructured.
For geopolitical reasons, for security reasons.
For all those reasons. As that happens, the U.S. is losing that deflationary safety valve.
So what happens when the stuff we used to get cheaply from China is now made here or in more expensive partner countries?
It gets more expensive. This transition links directly to our current economic issues with inflation. Domestic manufacturing often comes with higher labor and regulatory costs. So the U.S. can no longer rely on that flood of cheap imports to keep inflation dormant.
So decoupling might be necessary for national security, but it comes with a real economic cost.
A quantifiable and significant economic cost in terms of upward pressure on consumer prices, yes.
So we have two economic titans. China created systemic debt and a demographic collapse through its growth model.
And the U.S. created staggering sovereign debt and internal political chaos through the privileges of its global hegemony.
It really is a battle of internal contradictions, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. And analyzing how each country manages those internal contradictions, their ability to undermine long-term resilience, is far more illuminating than just tracking short-term GDP figures.
Okay, with the strengths and vulnerabilities of both nations mapped out, we can finally address the core question with more sophistication. What is the prognosis for the crossover?
Will China achieve nominal economic supremacy? And if so, when?
Right.
I think the biggest takeaway for anyone following this debate is how dramatically the consensus has shifted.
It's a huge change.
A huge change. If we had done this deep dive 5 years ago, the narrative of inevitability would have completely dominated the conversation.
Right.
Institutions were confidently predicting the crossover would happen in the late 2020s.
But those relentless structural headwinds we just discussed, the demographic cliff, the property crisis, these things are real and they force a massive recalibration.
A massive one, among the world's most sophisticated financial modelers. The sources specifically point out that leading institutions, we're talking the IMF, research divisions at banks like Goldman Sachs, have all significantly changed their timelines.
And where are they now?
Analysts are now pushing that crossover date well into the mid-2030s. And maybe more importantly, a growing minority of analysts are now questioning if it will happen at all.
In nominal terms.
In nominal U.S. dollar terms, within the next generation, the speed has slowed that dramatically, and the destination is no longer a certainty.
And this uncertainty comes directly from the possibility that China might just fail. Fail to make that incredibly difficult pivot from labor-intensive growth to high-value innovation.
Exactly. If the economy can't generate enough domestic demand and productivity stalls, we're looking at a scenario far worse than just a slowdown. You introduced a powerful term earlier. Secular stagnation.
Tell us more about that.
Secular stagnation refers to a prolonged structural period of low or near zero economic growth. It's often accompanied by deflationary pressures and low interest rates. It's an economic malaise that's rooted in structural problems, not just the temporary dips of a business cycle.
And that's a real risk for China.
It's a very real risk if they can't rebalance their growth engine toward consumption and away from unproductive investment, and if their demographic crisis just guts their labor capacity and demand.
To give our listener a clear picture, what's the best historical comparison for what that could look like if it were to grip China's economy?
The clearest parallel economists draw is the path of Japan after its asset bubbles burst in the early 1990s.
Right, the lost decades.
The famous lost decades. Japan had achieved these incredible heights of industrial and technological power, a lot like China today, but a combination of asset price collapse, structural rigidity, and extremely rapid population aging.
It led to stagnation.
It led to decades where growth was minimal, deflation was persistent, and the government just struggled to use fiscal stimulus to reignite the engine. If China fails to manage its immense debt and demographic contraction, it risks a similar outcome. It'll still be huge, but it will lack the dynamism needed to achieve the nominal growth rates to truly challenge U.S. supremacy.
This complexity really leads us away from a simple winner-takes-all race. It's more like a bipolar economic order is emerging.
That's the ultimate conclusion.
The two economies are just too vast and too structurally different to be compared, like they're two runners on a track.
I think that's exactly right. The rivalry is intense, but it is not a zero-sum game. The interdependence between Beijing and Washington remains profound.
Even with all the aggressive rhetoric, the trade barriers, the decoupling.
Even with all of that, the protectionism is real, but the interdependence is just as real.
Give us a concrete example of that interdependence, just to show why a policy decision in one capital can send shockwaves across the other's economy.
Okay, consider this. The two economies are just inextricably linked through trade and capital flows. So let's say there's a major contraction in China.
A big slump in consumer spending because of the property crisis.
Perfect example. That sends immediate shockwaves through global commodity markets, which hurts countries that supply raw materials, but it also directly hammers U.S. multinational corporations that rely on the huge Chinese consumer market for their profits.
And their stock prices take a hit on Wall Street.
Almost instantly. It's a direct connection.
And what about the other way, the impact of U.S. policy on China?
Conversely, a domestic monetary policy decision here in Washington, let's say interest rate hikes by the U.S. Federal Reserve, that drastically strengthens the U.S. dollar.
Which we've seen recently.
And a strong dollar makes U.S. capital markets really attractive, which can lead to capital flight from developing nations, including China. It also hurts Chinese exports by making their goods more expensive for buyers holding those stronger dollars.
So it's a headwind against their export economy.
A direct headwind. They are locked in this deep, complicated economic embrace where one's internal stability is constantly impacting the other's external competitiveness.
And understanding the dynamics of that embrace really requires you, the listener, to be fluent in the vocabulary we've been using. These aren't just academic terms.
Right at all. They are the levers of global power. They're the language of the financial markets. When you hear about protectionism, you have to immediately think about nominal versus PPP to get the real meaning of supremacy.
Understanding the demographic dividend and the demographic cliff is essential.
It's essential for understanding China's long-term capacity. Grasping capital fluidity explains the U.S. innovation edge, and recognizing the exorbitant privilege is the key to understanding American fiscal risk. The complexity of this rivalry is expressed directly through this vocabulary.
So this deep dive has really shown us that the U.S.-China rivalry isn't just a race for the biggest GDP number.
Not at all.
It's fundamentally a collision between two distinct models of governance and development.
The centralized, state-planned, infrastructure-heavy model of China
versus the dynamic, market-driven, capital-intensive model of the United States.
And both are vying to define the economic landscape of the 21st century.
And ultimately, I think the sources guide us to a really powerful final analysis. The question of whether China formally overtakes the U.S. in a technical, nominal GDP sense.
It's arguably less important for the future of the world than how both of these nations manage their unique and very severe internal contradictions.
Let's summarize those core contradictions one last time, because they really are the true measure of future resilience.
For the United States, the contradictions are that crippling systemic debt load that the exorbitant privilege lets them paper over.
Yeah.
And the destructive economic drag caused by this relentless political polarization. These factors just erode the nation's ability to act cohesively.
And for China?
For China, the contradiction is trying to simultaneously manage the demographic collapse, that shrinking labor force, and the immense shadow debt that's all tied up in their unstable property sector.
It's a profound realization, isn't it? That the future of global stability might hinge less on which nation posts the highest growth percentage next quarter.
And more on which country proves better at overcoming its own self-inflicted wounds.
And all of this rivalry is playing out against a backdrop of shared existential global challenges that really demand cooperation, not competition.
A level of cooperation that is often completely absent. The sources explicitly point out that both nations have to eventually address these massive global challenges, specifically citing the threat of climate change and the urgent need for global AI safety regulation.
Economic strength is one thing, but the ability to rise above national competition to tackle threats that transcend borders, that's something else entirely.
It's a different kind of strength, and maybe a more important one.
So, as you reflect on all of this, here is the final provocative thought for you to mull over. The true metric for long-term national resilience and stability might not be raw economic output. The future might instead be defined by which nation proves better at mitigating its own domestic pathologies. The political gridlock, the unchecked debt, the population implosion, all the things that can overshadow those impressive raw economic growth figures.
So the ability to manage your own internal weakness is the true hallmark of an enduring global superpower.
It might just be.
A fascinating insight. It suggests the most difficult economic battle is often fought within your own borders. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Keep challenging the simple headlines and always look for the nuance hidden in the metrics. Goodbye. Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're jumping into a topic that honestly feels like it's defining our entire era.
It really is.
We're taking a deep look at the source material you've all shared with us, focusing on this escalating technological competition between Washington and Beijing. For a long time, this whole rivalry was just boiled down to, simple numbers, trade deficits, raw GDP.
And that's exactly the trap we want to avoid today. It's so easy to get fixated on those big macro numbers, but our mission for this deep dive is to really move past them.
Because they only tell half the story.
At best. I mean, analyzing only how much stuff is being produced globally gives you a very incomplete picture. We need to get into what the sources are calling the technological imperative.
The technological imperative
Is the true crucible of this competition. The whole game is shifting. It's not a quantitative race anymore, who has the biggest economy. It's becoming a qualitative one.
So it's not about the size of the factory, but what the factory's actually making.
Precisely. It's about what is produced, and maybe even more critically, who controls the choke points for producing the most advanced, future-critical technologies.
So we're not just tracking shipping containers anymore. We are, in a way, charting a fundamental, intentional rewiring of the whole global economic architecture.
That's a great way to put it, a seismic shift.
And it's a shift that's going to dictate way more than just geopolitical power. It's going to have really tangible impacts on, everything. The next phone you buy, the long-term stability of the global financial system. So let's unpack this. Let's get into the specific strategies and the counter strategies that are driving this whole fracture.
Indeed. And to really get a grip on the current moment, we have to start with the dramatic intentionality behind China's economic planning, especially over the last decade or so.
Right. This isn't something that just happened organically.
Not at all. This is not just, organic growth driven by a bit of consumer demand. This is a meticulously planned, state-driven strategic pivot. A pivot away from the very foundations that originally made China an economic superpower.
Okay, so let's detail that pivot. Because for decades, as you said, China was the world's factory. That was the brand. Synonymous with high-volume, low-margin products.
The cheap toys, the footwear, the basic electronic components that, powered that whole wave of globalization.
And the sources show this really aggressive, policy-driven shift away from that. It's like they're actively trying to decommission the industrial model that generated all their initial wealth.
And, this is driven as much by necessity as it is by ambition. That old model, it just had inherent limitations. Relying on an endless supply of cheap labor is completely unsustainable once your population starts to age and wages naturally begin to rise.
Plus, the environmental cost must have been staggering.
Immense.
Yeah.
And it also exposed China to a classic economic problem, the middle income trap, which is a concept we should definitely circle back to. So the new policy focus, the new North Star for Beijing, is something they call the New Productive Forces, or NPF.
That phrase, new productive forces, it sounds very political, very much like jargon. What does it actually encompass on the ground?
It is a bit of jargon, but it's incredibly significant. It's a high-level strategic declaration. It signals a wholesale redirection of state investment, of R&D, of all their resources towards sectors that have high value-added capabilities, sectors that are, future-oriented.
So this isn't just about making better widgets.
No, this is not about marginal improvements in existing industries. This is about trying to leapfrog the current technological leaders entirely.
Which means, what are the specific sectors we're talking about here, the ones that are going to define this next industrial revolution?
The sources, they all consistently point to three really interconnected pillars. The first is artificial intelligence, AI. That's the foundational layer, the technology that will optimize every other industrial process, from manufacturing and logistics all the way to defense.
Okay, so AI is number one.
Number two is electric vehicles,
Yeah.
EVs, which are, as we can all see, just rapidly reshaping global transport and energy consumption. And third, and this is tied to EVs, is green energy infrastructure. We're talking solar, wind, and especially battery technology.
Because that's what determines power dynamics in a world that's moving beyond carbon.
Exactly. These are the fields where control of the technology establishes the standards for everyone else. And when you set the standards, you have technological hegemony.
What's really fascinating looking at the sources is the sheer speed of this pivot, especially when you look at the EV sector. I mean, it is arguably the most visible, the most concrete evidence of this NPS strategy actually working right now.
It's the poster child for the strategy.
China has gone from being, a marginal player in global car manufacturing to the undisputed global leader in just over a decade. And this success, it seems to be entirely wrapped up in this concept of technological sovereignty.
Technological sovereignty is the key. It's the entire driving philosophy behind the NPF. It means a nation wants to control the whole life cycle of its critical technologies, from the raw material in the ground to the final product rolling off the assembly line.
The goal being to minimize any external dependence.
especially on geopolitical rivals. For the EV sector, this meant China set out to build a completely self-sufficient, closed-loop ecosystem.
Which is a huge contrast to the old auto industry. In the internal combustion engine era, the traditional powers, Germany, the US, Japan, they controlled the really complex mechanical knowledge, all the IP, the supply chains for engine components. China's strategy seems to be to just skip that whole legacy system.
They're trying to build a new game and be the master of it. They've bypassed the incumbent advantage of traditional automakers by zeroing in on and controlling the new industrial choke points, which are the battery and all the critical materials you need to build that battery. The sources make it absolutely clear that China's dominance here isn't just about having massive assembly plants, like BYD or NIO. It's about cornering the market on the deepest, most fundamental layers of the supply chain.
Okay, let's dig into those specific choke points, because that's where the real power lies. Where exactly does China exert this disproportionate control in the EV process?
Well, it starts right at the beginning, at the raw materials stage, and even more importantly, through the processing. Now, lithium itself, the metal, is mined all over the world, Australia, Chile, other places, but China absolutely dominates the crucial refining and processing stage.
So they don't have to own the mines to control the market.
Exactly. The sources indicate that China controls over 60% of the world's chemical processing capacity for lithium. And for other key battery components like cobalt and graphite, it's often over 70%. Without that processing capacity, the raw ore you dig out of the ground is useless. It cannot become a usable battery component.
So that means even if Western powers tried to, say, rapidly scale up their own domestic mining operations, they'd still have to ship all those raw materials to China for the necessary chemical transformation before they could even think about building a finished battery. That's a huge bottleneck.
It's a massive strategic bottleneck. But the control doesn't even stop there. They also dominate the actual manufacturing and scaling of the batteries themselves. You have to look at companies like contemporary Amperex technology, CATL and BYD.
CATL is a giant.
A behemoth. It is, by a huge margin, the world's largest battery producer. Its global market share is significantly larger than its nearest Western rivals combined. And what's more, they were really aggressive in pioneering and scaling LFP batteries. That's lithium iron phosphate.
Right, which are different from what many Western car makers were using.
Very different. LFP batteries are cheaper, they're safer, and they're ideal for mass-market EVs. That gave them a significant cost advantage over the nickel, manganese, cobalt, or NMC chemistries that were preferred in a lot of Western luxury vehicles.
So, if you're Ford or Volkswagen, even if you design this amazing cutting-edge EV, you're often still reliant on Chinese-made batteries, or at least key Chinese components, just to hit your cost and scale targets. That seems to give Beijing immense geopolitical leverage.
Immense. Think about it. If the global economy continues on this rapid trajectory toward electrification, and all the sources agree this is an unavoidable path, then China controls the means of energy storage, and increasingly, the means of clean energy generation, too.
It's a fundamental reframing of this situation.
It is. This is not just about a company selling batteries to make a profit. This is a geopolitical insurance policy for a nation. It's about, and this is a quote from one of the sources, future-proofing their dominance in a post-carbon world.
So if the world transitions away from depending on Middle Eastern oil or Russian gas?
The new geopolitical currency becomes control over the green energy transition. And China has methodically secured a massive head start in that race.
That sets the stage perfectly for the next step in their strategy, because once you've successfully pivoted your production to high-tech goods like advanced batteries and AI components, you need a reliable, uninterrupted way to get those products to every single corner of the globe.
And you need to do it without relying on the infrastructure built and controlled by your rivals.
Exactly. The shift to new productive forces demands a global marketplace, which is why the logistical element here is so crucial. And this brings us directly to the physical manifestation of China's strategic ambition, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
The BRI, yes.
The BRI has been a constant feature in global headlines for years now, and it always seems to carry this dual, often contradictory narrative. So let's start with the perspective that often dominates Western analysis.
We have to acknowledge the critical view first, and critics, especially in Washington and in Europe, frequently label the BRI as debt trap diplomacy. This narrative is powerful, and it's based on some very observable data points.
So what are the core elements of that critique? What does a debt trap actually look like?
The critique basically posits that China offers these massive, often opaque loans to developing nations. Loans for huge infrastructure projects, sprawling ports, new railways, power plants.
And these aren't your typical World Bank loans.
No, they're often state-to-state, completely bypassing traditional multilateral institutions. And they're structured in a way that critics argue Beijing knows the receiving nation is going to struggle to repay.
And then what happens?
When that nation inevitably defaults, China steps in. They seize the strategic asset, or they secure a 99-year lease on it. So they gain long-term access and, of course, geopolitical influence. The sources consistently point to the example of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka as the sort of high-profile case study that's often used to illustrate this coercive model.
So it's framed as economic coercion that's just thinly veiled as development aid.
That view certainly holds validity in many analyses, particularly when you look at the immense debt burdens that some of the participating countries have accrued. However, if we shift our lens, as the sources demand we do, and we look at the BRI purely from a Chinese strategic economic standpoint, setting aside the ethics of the lending practices for a moment, it reveals itself as something else.
Which is?
It's a masterclass in export-led infrastructure development.
A masterclass in what? Exactly. Explain the underlying mechanism there. What makes it so potent for China's own industrial strategy?
Its potency is really in its dual function. First, it addresses China's own massive domestic industrial overcapacity. I mean, after years and years of just breakneck construction growth at home, sectors like steel, cement, heavy machinery, even construction labor itself, they reached a saturation point domestically.
So they had all this capacity with nowhere to go.
Exactly. The BRI provides a massive state-backed foreign market for all that overcapacity. They export the steel, the cranes, the engineering firms, the labor. They export it all to build these projects abroad. And that maintains domestic employment and industrial output, even as their own domestic economy starts to slow down.
That's a pretty clever way to export a domestic economic problem. But the second part, the logistical goal, that seems far more important for the new productive forces strategy.
It is. It's the heart of the matter. The second function is all about geopolitical independence. By financing and physically building these ports, railways, and even digital infrastructure across Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and even reaching into Europe.
I'm thinking of their investment in the port of Piraeus in Greece.
That's a perfect example. By doing all this, China is constructing the actual logistical pathways. They are building the physical circulatory system for its own trade network.
And traditionally, global trade has relied on sea lanes and logistical choke points that were secured and standardized by Western naval and economic powers. I mean, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca, the Western-controlled financial systems for payment. China is essentially building bypasses around the established Western highway system.
Precisely. They are intentionally reducing their reliance on existing Western-controlled routes. By investing so heavily in land-based infrastructure through Central Asia and maritime infrastructure that links emerging markets directly to Chinese ports, they're making a significant strategic move. It's all about achieving economic independence and ensuring an uninterrupted flow of trade for all those high-tech goods they're now producing.
But doesn't the strategy carry a really high risk of geopolitical blowback? I mean, if the goal is to create friendly, reliable trade routes, how do the sources address the fact that this negative perception, the whole debt trap narrative, can actively undermine the goodwill you need to establish those lasting relationships?
That is the core internal contradiction that the sources highlight. It's a trade-off. The short-term economic gains from exporting overcapacity and the strategic security of having new routes are being weighed against the long-term diplomatic costs.
And it seems like they've made their choice.
For now, yes. In countries where the debt burden becomes crippling, the local political reaction often swings hard against China, which, ironically, makes those new trade routes less reliable in the long term. China seems willing, for the moment, to absorb that diplomatic friction because the strategic imperative uninterrupted market access for their high-tech exports is deemed absolutely paramount. It's a literal physical manifestation of moving toward a bifurcated world. They are physically constructing the roads and rails needed for their own economic sphere, completely independent of the West.
And that structural independence is the long-term goal. Okay, so we have China executing this really comprehensive strategy, pivot the economy to high-tech via MPF, and then build the global logistical system to support that high-tech export via the BRI. This kind of systemic challenge, it necessitates an equally dramatic response. So let's transition to the U.S. countermeasure. The sources confirm that the United States is not resting on its laurels, but the nature of its response. It feels revolutionary for American economic history.
It is. The U.S. response signifies a massive conceptual and political shift in American economic policy. We are witnessing what many analysts are describing as the definitive resurgence of industrial policy.
We really need to spend some time defining that because historically that phrase industrial policy has been treated almost as a political slur in the U.S., especially over the last, 30 or 40 years.
Oh, absolutely. That history is crucial to understanding the sheer magnitude of this shift. For decades, industrial policy was, frankly, taboo within the Western economic consensus. The orthodoxy, which was dominant since the 1980s under figures like Reagan and Thatcher, was that markets were inherently more efficient than governments, period.
The government's job was just to get out of the way.
Exactly.
Huh.
The government's role was strictly to set the rules of the game and then let the invisible hand of the market allocate capital based purely on cost optimization. Any attempt by the state to pick winners, to subsidize specific domestic industries, or to impose local content requirements was seen as inefficient, market distorting, and ultimately bad for the consumer and the global economy.
And now we are seeing explicit, massive government intervention. We're talking trillions of dollars in subsidies and targeted tax breaks, all aimed at very specific domestic industries. The geopolitical threat has completely overridden this long-standing free market dogma.
The realization, which was really spurred by the vulnerabilities exposed during the pandemic and then heightened by the strategic competition with China, is actually pretty simple. Efficiency, while economically desirable, does not guarantee national security. It doesn't guarantee supply chain resilience.
Right. The cheapest option isn't always the safest option.
Not when a geopolitical rival controls the key technological inputs, whether it's for your defense systems, your AI platforms, or your advanced medical equipment. The relentless pursuit of the lowest cost becomes a massive strategic liability. This shift in thinking is what allows for the active use of industrial policy, a state-led effort to strategically rebuild and protect critical domestic supply chains.
And the most concrete illustration of this new policy direction, the really high-profile example, has to be the HPS and Science Act of 2022.
The HPS Act is monumental. It's monumental because it represents a complete reversal of policy and an unambiguous statement of intent. Its purpose is a direct countermeasure to Chinese strategic dominance, and it's specifically targeting the semiconductor industry.
And we should be clear, semiconductors, microchips, they're not just for our phones and laptops.
No, they are the foundational technology of the 21st century. They are absolutely essential, not just for consumer electronics, but more critically for advanced military applications, for quantum computing, and for the development of all cutting-edge AI. They're the brains of the modern world.
So what does the Act actually fund, and what is the strategic objective beyond just, making more chips at home?
The Act allocates over $52 billion in direct subsidies, grants, and tax credits. And that money is for building and expanding semiconductor manufacturing facilities. They're called fabs within the United States. The primary explicit goal is really twofold. First, to reshore or friendshore the manufacturing of mature chips.
What are mature chips?
Those are the ones used in cars, power grids, everyday electronics. The idea is to ensure a baseline resilience so the country isn't crippled by a shortage of basic components. Second, and this is the more critical part, it aims to accelerate the development and manufacturing of cutting-edge, leading-edge chips. We're talking 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, and below which are currently dominated by manufacturing in Taiwan and South Korea.
So the U.S. is basically trying to drag this highly complex, incredibly capital-intensive industrial ecosystem across oceans in just a matter of years. The scale of that intervention is just staggering.
It's a massive undertaking. These fabs, they cost tens of billions of dollars to construct. They require highly specialized labor and incredibly intricate supply chains. But the ultimate aim is comprehensive supply chain resilience. The U.S. realized that relying almost exclusively on these highly concentrated manufacturing hubs in Asia, particularly in Taiwan, which is an explicit geopolitical flashpoint, posed an unacceptable existential risk.
So the HPS Act is to ensure that critical technologies can be sourced securely.
Exactly. Protected from external shocks, whether they're natural disasters, pandemics, or, explicit political actions by a rival power. The industrial policy here is completely subservient to the national security objective.
Which means we now have two comprehensive, powerful, and increasingly opposing strategies fully engaged. China is pivoting its industrial base and building its own infrastructure, and the U.S. is actively using government money to rebuild high-tech manufacturing at home. The logical next step in our deep dive, then, is the forecasting game.
Absolutely. The natural question that just arises from this intense competition is when? When might that strategic crossover point actually occur? Or when might the gap between these two competing systems become so defined that they just separate permanently?
And forecasting, especially in global economics driven by policy, is a really precarious game. The sources wisely remind us that it's often based on extrapolation. And that's a risky assumption, right? That current trends will just continue indefinitely, ignoring the inevitable black swan events or internal structural crises that always pop up.
Which is exactly why relying on a single prediction is irresponsible. We have to entertain multiple possibilities based on how these internal pressures within China and the external reactions from the U.S. might play out. The sources suggest three pivotal potential futures that could define the scope of the U.S.-China relationship and really the future of the entire global economy.
Okay, let's detail scenario A. The sources call it the overtake. This is the scenario that I imagine drives strategic planning across the Pentagon and Washington agencies. It's the one that requires China to execute its strategic pivot almost flawlessly.
The overtake scenario is conditioned on China successfully navigating several immense, and I mean immense, internal economic hurdles. The first and most immediate major challenge is that colossal domestic property crisis.
Right, we've all heard about Evergrande.
Evergrande is just the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about massive debt overhangs created by property developers, compounded by extensive municipal and provincial government debt that was often guaranteed by land sales.
And if that property sector crisis really explodes, it could trigger a systemic financial collapse, something similar to the 2008 subprime crisis in the U.S., but potentially magnified, given the sheer size of the Chinese banking sector.
Precisely. If, however, and this is a big if the government can successfully navigate this debt crisis, if they can manage a soft landing through controlled bankruptcies, asset write-downs, and a gradual restructuring, then it removes the major financial drag that is currently slowing their growth. That's condition one.
And condition two, I'm guessing, relates to demographics, which is arguably the deepest structural problem China faces: a rapidly aging workforce and a shrinking pool of young labor.
That's where the technological promise of the new productive forces becomes absolutely essential. It's the mechanism for continued rapid growth. China must successfully automate its aging workforce through mass-scale robotics and AI deployment. They have to dramatically increase productivity per worker. The sources point out that China is already, by far, the world's largest purchaser of industrial robots. They have to execute this swap human labor for highly productive machine labor on a scale that has never been seen before, anywhere in the world.
So if they manage to stabilize their financial system and successfully use automation to mitigate the demographic crisis, they could maintain their momentum. What does the outcome look like in that scenario?
If both of those conditions are met, the sources suggest China could eclipse the U.S. economy by the mid-2030s. And not just in nominal size, but crucially in technological sophistication in key areas like AI, quantum computing, and green tech. This success would completely validate their strategic pivot, and it would establish China as the new technological hegemon.
Okay, that's the high-flying success story for them. But what if those internal structural challenges prove to be too immense? That brings us to scenario B, stagnation.
Stagnation is predicated on the exact opposite set of conditions. China failing to make that necessary transition from an economy led by investment and exports to one that's driven by domestic consumption and high-end innovation. The mechanism here is them falling squarely into the middle income trap.
Let's take a moment to detail the middle income trap for our listener. It's more than just a catchy phrase. It describes some very specific institutional failures, right?
It is indeed a major developmental hurdle that many countries face. A country reaches middle income status usually due to the advantages of cheap labor, massive fixed capital investment, and plugging into global export manufacturing. But as the country develops, wages naturally rise. And when that happens, it loses its competitive advantage of cheap labor relative to poorer nations like, say, Vietnam or India today.
So they can't compete on cost anymore.
Right. But at the same time, they simultaneously fail to develop the institutional maturity, the independent and deep capital markets, the advanced education systems, and the open intellectual property protection that are necessary to compete with established, high-income, innovation-led economies like the US, Germany, or Japan. So they get stuck. They stall out, unable to make that leap to truly innovation-led growth.
So in this scenario, China fails to produce the next generation of truly novel, world-leading technologies, the leapfrogging that NPF promised, because it lacks these fundamental institutional foundations.
Correct. Investment slows, productivity growth stagnates, and the massive weight of the property crisis proves to be just too heavy to manage. The result is a protracted period of economic slowing, perhaps resembling the lost decades that Japan experienced after its own property bubble burst back in the 1990s.
And what about the U.S. in this stagnation scenario? How does it fare?
In that case, the U.S. maintains its existing technological and economic lead. The sources indicate this lead is supported by two main pillars. First, the incredible resilience and depth of its existing innovation ecosystem. The combined power of its top universities, venture capital, and established tech giants. And second, its demographic stability.
A huge advantage.
A huge one. Unlike China, the U.S. continues to benefit from immigration and a relatively younger workforce, which provides a continuous supply of both labor and entrepreneurial talent. That innovation, coupled with that demographic advantage, ensures U.S. hegemony continues pretty much unchallenged.
Okay, so we have the overtake, where China wins, and stagnation, where the U.S. maintains its lead. But the sources overwhelmingly suggest that a third scenario C is actually the most probable. And this one forces a fundamental change to the global structure itself.
That is scenario C, parity and bifurcation. And this scenario moves us away from that traditional zero-sum game of who is number one and toward a much more complex, much more fractured global structure.
How is this parity defined in the source material? What does it look like?
Parity, in this context, describes a world where neither superpower achieves or maintains absolute hegemony. Both remain immensely powerful. They both control key technological domains, massive financial systems, and have significant global military influence. But neither can dictate terms unilaterally to the other, or to the majority of the rest of the world.
So power becomes balanced in a way.
It becomes balanced, leading to a multipolar state where influence is more regional, or maybe highly specialized by sector. So, for example, China dominates batteries in 5G, while the U.S. dominates advanced AI chips and financial services.
And the immediate, unavoidable consequence of reaching this kind of rough parity.
The inevitable result is a bifurcation, a decoupling of the global economic system. If neither side can subdue or fully integrate the other, they simply stop playing by the same shared rules. They begin constructing parallel systems that reflect their own strategic priorities and, most importantly, their own security needs.
Okay, let's now take that deep dive into the practical reality of bifurcation. This is a concept that's often used pretty abstractly, but what does it actually mean for the global system, for businesses, for consumers, and for all the smaller nations caught in the middle?
Bifurcation means the end of globalization as we knew it. The deep integration that really defined the last 30 years, where you had these complex supply chains spanning the entire globe, based purely on optimizing for cost and speed, and largely ignoring geopolitical risk, that era is now irrevocably unraveling.
It's over.
It's over. We're seeing the physical and systemic separation of technological and financial standards. The world simply stops functioning as one interconnected, standardized market system.
So it's separating into two distinct economic and technological spheres, a Western bloc centered around the U.S. and an Eastern bloc centered around China.
Precisely. And the defining characteristic is that these blocs will operate with increasingly independent and often incompatible standards and systems.
What are some of the key distinctions between these two spheres? Specifically on technological standards. We're not just talking about which country you buy your phone from. This goes deeper.
Much deeper. It's fundamental. In the Western bloc, technological standards are usually dictated by bodies like the 3GPP from mobile standards, or they're regulated by entities like the FCC or Europe's GDPR, with an emphasis on data privacy, intellectual property protection, and often democratic institutional oversight.
And the Eastern bloc.
The Eastern bloc, which is driven by much more state-centric security goals, will develop and implement completely different technological standards.
Here.
We've already seen the beginnings of this with 5G infrastructure, where Huawei's technology is effectively incompatible or banned in the Western sphere. This fracture is going to extend to AI governance, to data localization requirements, to cybersecurity protocols, everything.
And then there are financial systems. That's where the systemic decoupling gets really complex and, frankly, pretty dangerous for global stability.
Absolutely. The Western financial system is anchored by two massive pillars: the U.S. dollar's dominance as the primary global reserve currency, and the SWIFT financial messaging network, which is basically the plumbing used for virtually all secure cross-border transactions.
And in a bifurcated world.
In a bifurcated world, the Eastern Bloc develops and aggressively expands alternatives to reduce their vulnerability to U.S. sanctions or financial pressure, a vulnerability that was made painfully clear to the world by the Western sanctions placed on Russia.
So what are the specific alternatives that are being pushed by the Eastern Bloc?
The primary alternative is the expansion and internationalization of systems like China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS. CIPS allows for yuan-denominated transactions to completely bypass SWIFT, which minimizes the U.S. Treasury's visibility and control. Furthermore, countries within that eastern orbit will increasingly rely on direct currency swaps rather than converting their local currencies into U.S. dollars first, which further chips away at the dollar's transactional supremacy.
The goal is to build a financial fortress.
A fortress that is sanction-proof from Washington. Exactly.
This uncertainty, this separation of standards, it has massive, immediate, and really costly consequences for global businesses and ultimately for consumers like you listening. I mean, when the world was integrated, the mandate for a global COO was simple: optimize for efficiency.
That optimization paradigm is dead. It's gone. The emerging two-block structure means that businesses can no longer simply optimize for efficiency. Geopolitical risk has become the singular, overriding variable in all global supply chain management.
What does that shift actually mean on the ground for, say, a multinational company operating in consumer electronics?
It translates directly to redundancy and incredibly costly duplication. A company can no longer maintain one highly lean, single-source supply chain. They are now forced to source components from multiple distinct geopolitical zones just to ensure business continuity. If you're selling into both the U.S. and China, you cannot risk being cut off from one of those markets due to sanctions or technical incompatibility.
So you have to build two of everything.
You basically have to have a complete China-for-China supply chain, using local components, local standards, local financial systems, and then a totally separate rest of the world supply chain that adheres to Western standards and uses Western components.
That significantly increases operational costs and complexity. And when global businesses have to move from efficiency to security, it means those iPhones and Teslas will inevitably be built with more expensive, regionally sourced, or duplicated components. For you, the listener, the ultimate outcome of bifurcation is inflationary pressure, and maybe less product choice as companies focus on securing their production rather than maximizing consumer savings.
It is the single most important strategic shift for global corporate planning in decades. Companies are now optimizing for geopolitical security above all else. They are willingly accepting higher operational costs, larger inventories, and lower profit margins just to ensure they have redundancy and resilience in a world where trade wars and sanctions are a permanent feature of the landscape.
This clash isn't only about the two titans, though. This competition creates a massive ripple effect that profoundly changes the leverage held by the rest of the world.
This is perhaps the most intriguing consequence of parity and bifurcation. We have to focus on the impact on the global south, the emerging markets in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. For years, these nations often felt compelled to align economically with the West, or they struggled to find financing for necessary large-scale infrastructure projects.
But now, with both superpowers desperately vying for influence, for market access, for resources, and for diplomatic support,
they are now in a unique and historically powerful position. They can actively arbitrage between the two powers.
Arbitrage. Explain what that means in this geopolitical context.
It means capitalizing on the competitive tension between the U.S. and China to secure the maximum national benefit for themselves. They can essentially play one off the other.
So they can pick and choose the best offer from each side without having to commit fully or solely to one sphere of influence?
Precisely. They can leverage the competitive environment. For example, a nation can take rapid, large-scale infrastructure investment. The ports, the high-speed rail, the power grids from China, which is often offered with very few immediate political conditions regarding human rights or internal governance.
And at the same time,
simultaneously, they can approach the U.S. or its allies for crucial elements that China might not offer, like security guarantees, access to advanced Western financial markets, high-level technological standards like data security platforms, or direct foreign investment from Western corporations.
That dramatically shifts the balance of power. Nations that were previously viewed as, passive recipients of aid are now turning into active geopolitical players who are negotiating the terms of their own development by managing the expectations of two global rivals.
It creates a whole new strategic space for them. Leaders in these nations can maximize their national interest by carefully managing their alignment, ensuring they get the hard infrastructure they need from the East while securing the high-tech, financial security, and standard setting they need from the West. This active balancing act is the ultimate expression of a truly multipolar, bifurcated world.
This has been a really intensive look at how technology has, usurped raw economic size as the ultimate measure of global power. We've moved from simply analyzing a high-stakes economic rivalry, whose GDP is growing faster, to dissecting a complex technological race, the pivot to new productive forces, the U.S. counter-strategy with the GIPS Act. And all this friction is leading us toward a fragmented world order, supported by competing infrastructure like the BRI and counter systems like CIPS.
And the synthesis offered by the source material is profound. This transition from optimizing for efficiency to optimizing for geopolitical security is the most fundamental and lasting change in global business and policy in decades. It affects every single sector, every supply chain, every capital expenditure decision being made globally. And it implies a world that is more expensive, more complex, and ultimately less integrated than the one we grew up in.
So let's conclude with a provocative thought for you to carry forward. If optimizing for geopolitical security is the new costly norm for global business, that means efficiency has to be purposefully sacrificed. The global system we have is built on decades of hyper-efficient integration. So considering everything we've discussed, the need for reshoring, the importance of dual sourcing, the threat of bifurcation, what is the first established, highly efficient, highly integrated global supply chain beyond semiconductors that you believe will be purposefully broken apart in the next 5 years, just to create secure, domestic, or friend-shored redundancy? And what do you think the economic cost of that will be?
Keep that question in your mind as you read the news this week. Don't just consume the headlines. Really engage with this underlying shift from efficiency to security. Start connecting the dots between policy, technology, and cost, and think critically about the implications of a world fractured into these distinct economic and technological spheres. That's how you stay ahead of the curve.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the technological fault lines shaping tomorrow's economy.
We'll catch you next time. Goodbye for now.